Scoundrels, written by Paul Caranci, audio by Max Bowen, and edited by Skylar Batz. It has been said that political corruption is as old as government itself. Yet despite its timeless nature and its devastating impact on society, political corruption remains an elusive term. Listen to each episode of Scoundrels for some amazing stories about greed, corruption, and arrogance that sometimes defines politics in America.
Governor Edward DePreet. Providence Journal investigative reporters and staff writers Tracy Breton, Mike Stanton, David Herzog, and W. Zachary Malinowski spent hundreds of hours scouring through tens of thousands of pages based heavily upon court documents and records related to the DePreet case. Collectively, they provided in-depth coverage of the case in real time. This chapter is based heavily upon their research and the work they produced and published in a series written for the Providence Journal by them. There are occasions when an unscrupulous activity in the private sector can spill over into the public sector, creating an environment rife for political scandal, a sort of perfect storm for corruption. Perhaps this is one way to recount the saga of Governor Edward DePreet. Governor DePreet, just 3 years after leaving office, became the first governor of Rhode Island to be charged with corruption. The investigation started 4 years before that, in 1990, and resulted from the discovery of a $13 million bank embezzlement scheme orchestrated by Joseph Mollicone, the bank's president. The crime would later be described as the event responsible for setting off Rhode Island's worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The story of this scandal involves many different players and events, each intimately intertwined with the DePreet story. Like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, each fragment contributes to the ultimate disposition of the scandal. Recounting each element of this tale sequentially will help bring into focus the eventual charges against Governor Edward DePreet. Joe Mollicone, Providence banker and entrepreneur, and his partner, Rodney Brusini. 34-year-old lawyer J. Richard Ratcliffe was one of the Attorney General James E. O'Neill's first appointments to the newly created 5-member Special Prosecutions Unit of the Attorney General's office. With a focus on white-collar crime, the formation of the unit was long overdue and was already overburdened with potential cases when Ratcliffe accepted the appointment. He was investigating a case involving the pastor of St. Anthony's Church in North Providence, who was accused of embezzling some $200,000 from the collection plate and bingo money from the parish family when the call came from O'Neill regarding the alleged embezzlement of $13 million from Heritage Loan and Investment Company by its president, Joseph Mollicone. Later that day, after confronting Mollicone, O'Neill ordered a grand jury investigation. A week later, on November 8, 1990, Joseph Mollicone vanished, just 2 days after DePreet lost his bid for a fourth, 2-year term as governor. Less than 2 weeks following Mollicone's disappearance, the lame duck governor closed Heritage Loan and Investment Company, but it was too late. Mollicone's actions and the bank's collapse drained its insurer, the private Rhode Island Share and Deposit Indemnity Corp., RIS-DIC. After the draining of RIS-DIC imperiled the savings of several 100,000 depositors at a total of 45 Rhode Island banks and credit unions. Despite pleas from Attorney General O'Neill that it was a conflict of interest due to the potential involvement of top DePreet aides, DePreet ordered an investigation by the state police. In Rhode Island, such an investigation falls under the jurisdiction of the governor's office. Just as the RIS-DIC revelations were uncovering how a corrupt political system and a corrupt banking system can nourish each other, those with insider knowledge quietly began to systematically withdraw their money from the affected institutions. On December 30th, 1990, 2 days before Governor DePreet left office, the directors of the now drained Rhode Island Share and Deposit Indemnity Corp. Voted themselves out of business. RIS-DIC's president went straight from the meeting to pull his money out of a RIS-DIC insured bank before the vaults slammed shut. This is an opportunity that ordinary Rhode Islanders could not take advantage of, since the RIS-DIC proceedings were kept quiet. As a result, many bank board members, some of whom were politically connected as well, were charged with crimes in separate investigations of the RIS-DIC scandal. 2 days later, on the day of Governor Bruce Sunderland's inauguration, the RIS-DIC banks were closed per order of the new governor, separating hundreds of thousands of people from their savings. At just about the same time, an employee of the State Department of Employment Security phoned the Attorney General's office, complaining that some of the governor's people were pressuring him to enter into a lease for the Jesse Metcalf building in downtown Providence, a building that had been purchased and rehabilitated in 1988 by Joseph Mollicone and his partner, Rodney M. Brusini. Brusini was a longtime friend of Dupreet and once acted as his chief fundraiser. Mollicone owned several buildings, many of which were leased by departments of state government. However, for greedy insiders, it apparently wasn't enough that Employment Security had already moved into the Metcalf building in 1990. Mollicone now wanted the state to rent the 5th floor as well, space, according to Providence Journal investigative reporters, the state didn't even need. Paul Valeri, the director of finance for the Department of Employment Security, told the Attorney General that his boss, John S. Renza, an associate from the days when Dupreet served as mayor of Cranston, they introduced him to Mollicone and Brusini at a meeting intended to provide inside information regarding the department's rental needs to the Metcalf building owners. Not only did the state wind up renting the 5th floor space for more money than the landlords were originally asking for, but the owners then presented a $350,000 bill for renovations to the space that the estate never authorized. The state paid the bill anyway, over the objections of Valeri, who was told that he was not a team player, despite resistance from Valeri and others. The state's rental of the top floor moved forward, but eventually fell through when Paul Valeri went to the Attorney General after Mollicone's disappearance. Although citizens protested the bank closings and besieged the Attorney General's office with hundreds of tips on suspicious loans and unscrupulous politicians, the Mollicone lease arrangements remained the prime focus of investigators. Radcliffe assembled a team of investigators that included paralegal Peter Blessing, who had real estate expertise, and Lieutenant Robert P. Matos, a state police detective with a reputation for latching onto the jugular of those he suspected of wrongdoing. Sometime in January of 1991, Blessing came across a check in Mollicone's bank records, made out to Andorian Carpets in the amount of $875. In the memo box were the words Renza's Rug. This was of particular interest because a few days earlier, under grand jury questioning by Radcliffe, Renza couldn't recall the details of the lease and denied having spoken to Mollicone or Rodney Brusini before the agency put its rental requirements out to bid. The new information prompted a second trip by Renza before the grand jury. This time, under intense questioning about the rug, Renza collapsed and was taken to Kent County Memorial Hospital, where, despite his condition, Lieutenant Matos was able to obtain Renza's permission to search his home. Once recovered, Renza was arrested and charged with perjury, bid rigging, and obtaining money under false pretenses. Facing an onslaught of legal problems, Renza suddenly remembered everything. Renza admitted that he had discussed the Metcalf building lease with co-owners Joseph Mollicone and Ronnie Brusini before the state advertised its need for office space. Brusini was pushy, Renza recalled. Both he and Mollicone had smugly predicted that their bid would be the lowest. Matthias J. Santos, top aide in Dupreet's Department of Administration, does Dupreet's bidding in the assignment of A&E contracts. Renza also told investigators that after his state agency had moved into the Metcalf building, he was pressured to rent more space on the top floor. When he protested that the space was unnecessary, Renza said he received a phone call from an angry Dupreet aide. "God damn it," Renza recalled the man shouting. "I'm telling you to sign it." Renza identified the caller as Matthias J. Santos, a loyal member of the Dupreet administration and friend of Brusini and Dennis L. Dupreet, the governor's son. And this wasn't the only time that Santos, who served on the State Properties Committee, a powerful committee that approved state leases and purchases, pressured someone to sign state leases. Henry S. Woodbridge, Jr., the director of another job training agency, told investigators that Santos had screamed at him to move his agency into the building. When Woodbridge refused, he told investigators he received a phone call from Henry Fasano, Dupreet's chief of staff and another Metcalf building co-owner. Fasano ordered Woodbridge to move into the building, but Woodbridge still refused. Fasano later denied doing anything improper. Renza wasn't alone with his allegations of political interference. The state fire marshal, Everett Ignagne, also revealed details of a phone call he got from a union official telling him how irate Jake Kaplan, a Dupree contributor, and Dennis Dupree were that he was resisting attempts to have him rent space in Jake Kaplan's South Providence building.
From students to war story aficionados, Caranci's work captivates all. Prepare to be transported to different eras and perspectives. You're sure to find a story you love and can't put down. Visit www.paulcaranci.com now to discover your next unforgettable read. Don't miss out on these captivating historical narratives. Order your copy today and start your journey through time.
It was also discovered that Santos helped arrange the state's leasing of office space that was paid for even though the state didn't use it. Additionally, Santos was instrumental in obtaining for the owners thousands of dollars in renovations not previously approved by the state. All this after Santos received a $142,500 loan from Heritage Investment and Loan Company after a bad credit history resulted in a loan rejection by Fleet Bank. Despite these findings, and contrary to the judge's assertions, the Dupree case investigators believed that Santos had been involved in this overall scheme, as a prosecutor would later refer to the state's rental of Joseph Mullicone's building. But they regarded Santos as merely a messenger, someone who did the Dupree's bidding, even though a judge would later rule that the state had knowledge of possible criminal activity involving Santos, ranging from conflict of interest violations to possible bribery and/or extortion. Prosecutors later argued that the behavior was certainly bad, but not criminal. It appeared that prosecutors were more interested in having Santos as a witness than a suspect. Under an immunity agreement, Santos told investigators that he took his direction regarding leases from Brasini. He also said that both Brasini and Fasano told him they wanted out of their partnership on the Metcalf building, but could only do so if the building were fully occupied. Santos, in defending his actions, also said that the construction bills for which the building partners were reimbursed by the state were legitimate. The big news, however, came in March of 1991. That's when Santos revealed to investigators that he had also been involved in choosing architects and engineers for state construction projects as well. Santos said that Dennis Dupree, the governor's engineer's son, would tell Santos whom to hire for projects. Although Dennis Dupree held no government position, said Santos, Santos followed his instructions because he assumed that the son was communicating his father's wishes. Apparently, the executive order Governor Dupree signed during his first year of office, creating the selection committee for architects and engineers, on which Santos had served, was a fraud. Santos and others made it clear to the grand jury that it was Edward Dupree himself who chose the architects and engineers. It was perfectly clear that it came from him and that he had picked the person, testified Frederick Lippitt, Dupree's former director of administration. I mean, said Lippitt, obviously the system was designed for political patronage, which isn't necessarily immoral. You give contracts to those who supported you. Frank N. Zano, engineer and political supporter of Governor Dupree, provides structure to the contracts for sale scheme. With these revelations, and after hearing rumors of state contracts for sale, the investigation turned in a new direction. Investigators found a letter written in 1988 by architect Walter Powers to Dennis Dupree, in which Powers asks Dennis if he could possibly motivate some positive activity by the state. For the first time, investigators had proof of the governor's son's involvement. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Matos was receiving word from other architects that several other engineers and architects had paid Dennis Dupree for state contracts. The tipsters identified Frank Zano as a key player. Other architects he worked with included David Presby, Donald R. Conlon, and Norton Salk. Although Conlon and Salk testified before the grand jury that they had done nothing wrong, Matos believed he had evidence that Salk was a straw donor to Dupree, as he had his assistant make the donation after Salk had reached his legal contribution limit. A straw donor is defined as one who makes a contribution on behalf of another person who has already contributed the maximum amount allowed by law. It is illegal in Rhode Island to make a straw donation. Further, Salk instructed the assistant to lie about where the money came from. Additionally, investigators found two of Salk's checks made out to Zano. Salk was offered immunity for his truthful testimony and jumped at the opportunity. Salk now told the grand jury that in 1990 he had asked Frank Zano, whom he'd known for 30 years, to help him get bigger state jobs. Zano told Salk to come up with $25,000. So, over a 6-week period, Salk wrote 3 checks, totaling the requested amount. Zano later returned one of the checks, telling Salk he had paid too much. Salk didn't get the jobs he wanted. He told the grand jury Zano had never explicitly promised him the jobs. He had only said come up with $25,000. The testimony was enough for the grand jury to indict Donald Conlon for perjury. Investigators also discovered that money from Conlon's firm was transferred to Zano's firm, and that Conlon had also given money to friends to donate to the Dupree campaign once he had reached the legal contribution limit. Conlon decided to tell the grand jury what he knew. According to his version, it started innocently enough. Conlon simply donated to the campaign of a sitting governor, but once he reached the legal limit, he followed Zano's instructions and gave money to friends to contribute to the campaign in their names. He also started giving cash to Zano, something prohibited under campaign finance law, generally $4,000 to $5,000 a year. As the demands for money grew, Conlon told the grand jury, he opened a line of credit on his house. In 1988, after winning a $430,000 contract to work on the state training school, Conlon tried to cash a check for $10,000. The teller told him that federal law required her to report any transactions of $10,000 or more. Rather than face that scrutiny, he settled for $9,950, which he said he gave to Zano. Zano told Conlon that he would deliver the cash to Dennis Dupree, the governor's son. Zano often spoke of the younger Dupree as his contact for state jobs, Conlon testified. After Conlon got the training school contract, Zano passed along a request from Dennis Dupree. Conlon should hire Dennis's college roommate as an engineering subcontractor on the job. Conlon did. Presby was the next to testify before the grand jury on March 6, 1992. Under a grant of immunity, he testified that he believed the contributions had been necessary to get state work. As he gave more money, the jobs rolled in. The new Washington County Courthouse, the new Block Island Airport Terminal, the expansion of the Davies Vocational Technical School. The contributions began with checks for tickets to Dupree fundraising events, which Presby would deliver to Ronnie Brusini at the F.A. Dupree Insurance Agency in Cranston. Brusini was the governor's chief fundraiser, although Brusini held no government post, Presby testified. Presby made sure to tell him which state projects he was interested in. Eventually, Presby started dealing instead with Frank Zano. From their conversations, Presby gathered that Zano was reporting to Dennis Dupree, the governor's son. But Presby, like Salk and Conlon, testified that he never dealt directly with Dennis Dupree concerning contributions for state contracts. My sense, Presby told a grand jury, was that Dennis Dupree was making the decisions, or Dennis and the governor were making the decisions, on who was going to be doing the A&E work, the architect and engineering. Presby also testified that he too continued to make contributions to Governor Dupree after he reached the legal $2,000 limit by making contributions of cash. Between checks and cash, his annual contributions went from $2,000 to $4,500 to $6,150 to more than $27,500 in Dupree's last 2 years. Dupree's co-conspirators were running for cover. One friend of Frank Zano told the grand jury that he would not go to jail to protect Dupree. Zano and Dupree, a retrospective on friendship. Zano, a Charles Street native, eventually moved to Western Cranston, where he met his neighbor, Edward Dupree. They became good friends, however, only after Dupree was elected to serve on the Cranston School Committee. Dupree was serving on its building committee when Zano was doing work on the city's schools. Zano's career was burgeoning just as his business was growing, and he was elected president of the Rhode Island Society of Professional Engineers. He led the society as it discussed the need to reform government contracting rules in the wake of scandals in Maryland involving Vice President Spiro Agnew. Ironically, Richard Nixon's vice president had been forced to resign after pleading no contest to taking kickbacks for state contracts when he was governor of Maryland. Zano's relationship with Dupree blossomed, and Dupree's agency provided Zano's insurance needs, while their wives became close church friends. Dupree's eventual political rise took him from school committee to mayor, and Zano's influence grew. One Cranston architect recalled that Zano was in and out of the mayor's office all the time. This architect said that he relied on Zeno, his friend, to tell him where he stood on city contracts. The architect said that, to get work, Zeno had advised him, "You'll have to contribute heavily." Zeno would later tell a grand jury that payments made to Dupree fundraiser Ronnie Brusini were tied to how much work you got. In other words, if you did a lot of work, you'd better put in a lot of money. In 1984, when Dupree ran for governor for the first time, Zeno was his primary fundraiser, not only raising significant revenue for the cause, but also donating in excess of $20,000 himself, most of it in cash, that was given directly to Brusini, according to his grand jury testimony. Once Dupree was elected, but even before he was inaugurated, Zeno was planning his future, inquiring of outgoing Governor J. Joseph Garrahy if he knew of any big state contracts coming up for bid. While the former governor wasn't of much help, Zeno found his own project in the Frank Leach Judicial Complex on Benefit Street in Providence. Zeno testified before the grand jury that he went to Dupree's friend, fundraiser and colleague, Ronnie Brusini. Brusini told Zeno, according to grand jury testimony, that he would talk to Governor Dupree about the courthouse contract. When time passed with no word, Zeno began to worry. Finally, he asked his wife, Rosemarie Zeno, to talk to Patricia Dupree. The two had become close friends over the years. Subsequently, Zeno told the grand jury he was able to get into the governor's State House office to express his anxiety about getting the courthouse project. Dupree promised to have his chief of staff track it. Later, according to grand jury testimony, Zeno received a phone call from Brusini. The job was his, with a catch. Brusini asked what was customary for architects and engineers to pay to get state jobs. Zeno said he'd heard the going rate was 5% of the fee charged for a big project, 6% for a smaller project. Brusini, in his grand jury testimony, said he promised to take it up with the governor, and later reported to Zeno that it was a deal. Because the total project fee was $1 million, Zeno's cost would be $50,000. After striking a deal to count the previous contribution of $20,000 he had made to Dupree, he had to pay only $30,000. Zeno shared his 5 to 6% formula with other firms, including Robinson Green Beretta Corps, who, after paying Brusini, was awarded the $30 million contract to build the state's new medium-security prison. Brusini later testified that he had steered state projects to Dupree campaign contributors, even though he had held no official position in state government. Zeno's fortunes soon started to fade. The governor's son replaces Brusini as the heir to the governor. It was sometime in 1988, Frank N. Zeno told the grand jury, that he began to sense a rift within the Dupree camp. People were saying that Ronnie Brusini, Ed Dupree's old friend, was on the outs. Zeno saw a new face emerging, the governor's 28-year-old son. Concerned that Brusini might be skimming, Governor Dupree ordered Zeno to deal only with his son Dennis. The younger Dupree later told Zeno that the payment, from which they suspected Brusini was skimming, was made by developer Richard Beccari on behalf of Leonard Garofalo, in order for him to secure contract work for the prison intake center. Envelopes, thick with cash, flowed from Zeno to Dupree in such large numbers that Zeno had to open a bank account in the names of his children to hide the money from his wife who had filed for divorce. Meanwhile, Dennis Dupree, who owned his own engineering firm, escalated his demands. In grand jury testimony, Zeno's son recalled Zeno's complaints. That's all they want. Money, money, money. The demands would continue right up until Dupree lost his 1990 campaign to two-time challenger, millionaire Bruce Sundlun. Even then, Dennis Dupree wouldn't quit. In early 1991, with a new governor in place and most of Rhode Island embroiled in the banking crisis, he telephoned Zeno. Zeno later said that Dennis Dupree ordered him to round up money that architects still owed for Dupree administration work they were doing. When Zeno refused, Dennis protested, "They owe it to us," but Zeno said he would no longer shake people down. Dupree's world was unraveling, just as President George H.W. Bush was considering him for a federal appointment. State police began to pore through Zeno's records and question his friends. Donald Conlon was indicted for perjury, and Zeno believed he would talk. Zeno was offered a deal, but refused when he learned he would have to plead guilty to extortion. Zeno got lucky, however, when Attorney General O'Neill agreed to an immunity deal for Zeno believing that he needed Zano's testimony to nail Dennis DePreet. By fall of 1991, Zano had told investigators how he paid Dennis DePreet in exchange for state contracts, how Dennis had told him that he kept a log of all contributors and their contributions, and how everyone had to pay. Investigators learned how DePreet replaced Brasini as the person to talk to if you wanted a contract. One contractor told a grand jury that he had considered Dennis DePreet an ear to the governor. But more, the governor watched out for Dennis. In 1988, the Providence Journal carried stories chronicling complaints from Rhode Island environmental regulators. The regulators said they'd been pressured by the governor's office to approve wetlands permits for projects that Dennis DePreet was working on. Officials at the Department of Environmental Management were also displeased at the state's hiring of Dominic V. Titella, an engineer and DePreet loyalist, to conduct an environmental study, even though his firm had been rated last among the bidders. By all accounts, it was the governor and not his son that secured the work for Titella. Michael M. Doyle, DePreet's former chief of staff, who became one of the principals in the RDW Group, a high-powered Rhode Island-based public relations firm, testified the governor loved Titella. The governor and his son are connected to the RISDIC scandal. By all reports, Governor DePreet and his son were close. They were also the subjects of the RISDIC investigation, which, in 1992, revealed that Edward and Dennis DePreet had been involved in 2 Cranston land deals financed by questionable loans. The commission concluded that the loans had been based on faulty appraisals, and, in one instance, on property that was largely swampland. The commission traced a money trail from failed Rhode Island credit unions into various DePreet bank accounts. According to state records, Paul Marchionda, Dennis DePreet's partner from his engineering firm and a partner in one of the ventures, testified that Dennis DePreet had told him that the governor was a silent partner. Both DePreets denied that the governor was involved and said that the $30,000 check written to the governor from Dennis was a reimbursement of Dennis's college tuition money that the governor had paid. Perhaps no deal the DePreets were involved in was as spectacular as the Cranston land deal. In this transaction, the DePreets purchased land in 1988 and resold it on the same day for $2 million more than they paid, subject to a controversial zone variance that would allow for the construction of 240 apartments. Despite more than 100 residents in attendance at the zoning board hearing objecting to the project, the variance was granted. Those benefiting from the $2 million profit were the governor and Dennis DePreet, Dennis's brother Thomas, a son-in-law of former Cranston Mayor James Taft. A month later, the Texas developer received a state wetlands permit to develop another piece of land in North Providence. Dennis DePreet had done some engineering work on that property, and state environmental officials later said they had been pressured by the governor's office to issue the permit. While publicly, the governor issued an apology crafted by Doyle and another aide, Robert D. Murray. Privately, he was furious that he was forced to do so. All of this preceded the 1988 election that DePreet won by a scant 2% of the vote. Michael W. Piccoli finds a way to expand the governor's fortunes.
Listen to next week's episode of Scoundrel to find out what happens next. Politics, corruption, and so much more. Follow along. Thanks for listening.
Elite Handyman Services, over 35 years of trusted residential and commercial expertise. Elite Handyman Services is reminding motorists to slow down in residential zones and arrive alive. Never text or drink and drive. Elite Handyman Services, a name backed with over 35 years of experience in residential and commercial work. A full-service handyman, from home improvements, remodels, electrical, construction, plumbing, they do it all. 401-246-4197. That's 401-246-4197, or log into EliteHandymanServicesLLC.net.
Professionals who care.